The morning sun cast its golden light across the sprawling fields of Jake Carter's farm. Rows of corn swayed gently in the breeze, the sound like whispers between old friends. The farm sat nestled at the end of a dirt road just outside the small town of Red Hollow, surrounded by rolling hills and thick woods that seemed to guard its serenity. Jake Carter stepped out onto the porch of his farmhouse, a steaming cup of black coffee in hand. He was a tall man with a weathered face, his skin tanned from years under the sun. His eyes were sharp, a piercing shade of blue that seemed to hold secrets no one dared to ask about. Though his shoulders were slightly stooped with age, there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. Life on the farm was simple, and Jake liked it that way. He had spent over 2 decades in the military, serving in the Green Berets, a group of men trained to survive in the most hostile conditions. That life had hardened him, taught him discipline and survival, but it had also left scars, some visible, like the faint slash across his forearm, and others buried deep within. Now, Jake found solace in the rhythm of farm life. He tended to his crops, cared for his chickens, and repaired anything that needed fixing. Every morning, like clockwork, he'd check on his fields, walking with his old hound Max at his side. Max was a black and brown mix with a limp in his hind leg, but his loyalty was unwavering. Jake sipped his coffee and leaned against the porch railing, surveying his land. The barn, painted a fading red, stood proudly in the distance. It was old but sturdy, much like its owner. Hanging on the wall inside the barn, out of sight, was a small collection of medals and a photograph of Jake in his military days, standing with his unit. He rarely looked at them anymore. "Come on, Max," Jake said, his voice low and gravelly. The dog wagged his tail and followed as Jake stepped off the porch. The farm was a place of peace, but it wasn't without its quirks. Every so often, Jake would spot signs of wildlife trying to make a meal out of his crops or chickens. His solution was never violent. He'd learned long ago that brute force wasn't always the answer. Instead, he'd set up harmless deterrents, like cans that clattered together in the wind or decoys that scared off intruders. Jake worked methodically, his hands calloused but gentle as he checked the cornstalks for pests. As he worked, he hummed a tune, one he couldn't quite place but felt comforting nonetheless. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. Jake's nearest neighbor, Mr. Thompson, lived about half a mile down the road. The old man was in his late 70s, his white hair a stark contrast to his sun-weathered skin. Mr. Thompson had been a farmer all his life until arthritis forced him to slow down. Now he spent his days in his rocking chair, watching the world go by. "Morning, Jake," Mr. Thompson called out one day as Jake drove past on his rusty old tractor. The two often exchanged pleasantries, and on occasion, Jake would help the older man with tasks he couldn't manage anymore. Mr. Thompson had a granddaughter, Emily, who had come to live with him after her parents' divorce. Emily was 16, full of energy and curiosity, a stark contrast to the quiet life of Red Hollow. She had taken an interest in Jake's farm, often stopping by to ask questions about the animals or the crops. "Mr. Carter." Emily's voice rang out one afternoon as Jake was repairing a fence. She came bounding up the dirt road, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Jake looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun. "Emily," he greeted with a nod. "Do you think I could help you with the chickens today?" she asked, her enthusiasm evident. Jake chuckled softly. "You're welcome to try, but those hens can be feisty." Emily grinned. "I'm not afraid of a few chickens." Jake admired her determination. She reminded him of a younger version of himself, back before life had worn him down. Over time, Emily's visits became more frequent, and Jake found himself appreciating the company. Despite the simplicity of his current life, traces of Jake's military past were evident to those who paid attention. The way he meticulously organized his tools in the barn, each item in its designated spot, was one clue. His movements were precise, efficient, as though he were always prepared for something unexpected. Even his farm itself bore signs of his training. The perimeter was subtly fortified, not in an obvious way, but with small measures like reinforced gates and strategically placed barriers that could deter trespassers. To the average eye, it was just a well-maintained property, but to someone with a trained eye, it was clear Jake hadn't completely left his old life behind. One evening, as Jake sat on the porch whittling a piece of wood, Emily joined him, sitting cross-legged on the steps. "You've lived here a long time, haven't you?" she asked. Jake nodded. "Moved here after I left the service." "You were in the military, right?" Jake's hands paused for a moment before he resumed carving. "That's right." "What was it like?" Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gazed out at the horizon, where the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink. Finally, he said, "It was a different kind of life. Hard, but it taught me a lot." Emily sensed that was all she was going to get and didn't push further. She liked Jake's quiet strength, the way he seemed to have all the answers even if he didn't say much. As the days turned into weeks, Jake continued his routine, finding joy in the small things, like the first blooms of the season or the way Max wagged his tail whenever he saw him. Life on the farm was predictable, and Jake was content with that. But peace has a way of drawing those who seek to disrupt it. Red Hollow was a quiet town, but whispers of trouble had begun to circulate. A biker gang had been spotted in the area, their presence unsettling the locals. Jake heard about it from Mr. Thompson one morning. "Bunch of hooligans," Mr. Farrah Thompson grumbled. "They think they can ride through here and do as they please." Jake listened silently, his expression unreadable. He had dealt with troublemakers before, but he hoped this would blow over without incident. Little did he know, the calm he had worked so hard to cultivate was about to be tested. And though Jake Carter might have left the battlefield behind, it was clear that the battlefield hadn't entirely left him. Red Hollow was the kind of town where little ever changed. Its streets were lined with mom-and-pop shops, a diner that served the same menu for decades, and townsfolk who greeted one another by name. For years, it had been a place of peace, a sanctuary for those who preferred life at a slower pace. But peace is a fragile thing, and all it takes is a single ripple to disturb the still waters. That ripple came roaring into town one late afternoon, the sound of engines rumbling like distant thunder. The bikers came in a pack, a dozen or so riders clad in leather and denim, their jackets emblazoned with a snarling wolf's head surrounded by claws. This was the insignia of the Iron Claws, a biker gang with a reputation for violence and lawlessness. At the head of the group rode Razor, the gang's leader. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with long, greasy hair tied back in a ponytail. His beard was unkempt, his eyes cold and calculating. Razor wasn't just a thug, he was a man who thrived on fear, using intimidation as both a weapon and a shield. The bikers rolled down Main Street, their presence impossible to ignore. Engines roared as they revved their bikes, the noise echoing off the brick facades of the shops. Pedestrians froze in their tracks, shopkeepers peered nervously from their windows, and the air seemed to grow heavier. Razor grinned as he brought his bike to a stop in front of the diner. He swung one leg over the seat and stood, surveying the street like a king surveying his kingdom. "Nice little town you've got here," he said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. "Shame if something happened to it." The gang laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent a shiver down the spines of anyone within earshot. The bikers wasted no time making their presence felt. They stormed into the diner, commandeering tables and barking orders at the waitress. Razor made a show of tossing a wad of cash onto the counter, but the amount was far less than what they'd consumed. At the gas station, they filled their tanks and rode off without paying, leaving the attendant too frightened to protest. Word spread quickly. By evening, everyone in Red Hollow knew about the Iron Claws. The sheriff, an older man named Hank Russell, did his best to reassure the townsfolk, but there was only so much he could do. With limited manpower and resources, confronting a gang like the Iron Claws was a daunting prospect. "They'll move on soon enough," Hank told a small crowd gathered outside the general store. "They always do." But not everyone was convinced. Razor, however, had no intention of leaving just yet. As he and his gang gathered at a makeshift camp on the outskirts of town, Razor leaned back against his bike, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "This place is too quiet," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "We need to shake things up." One of the gang members, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, grinned. "What are you thinking, boss?" Razor's eyes narrowed, a predatory gleam in them. "These small-town folks think they're safe. Let's show them they're not." The group erupted in laughter, their voices carrying across the night air. The next morning, Jake Carter was tending to his crops when he heard the distant hum of engines. At first, he thought nothing of it. Motorcycles occasionally passed through the area, but as the noise grew louder, he realized this was no passing group. Jake straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. Max, his faithful dog, stood at his side, ears perked and tail stiff. The sound grew closer until finally, the bikers appeared on the horizon. They rode down the dirt road leading to Jake's farm, their bikes kicking up clouds of dust. Jake remained still, his expression unreadable as the gang pulled up and dismounted. Razor was the first to approach, his swagger evident in every step. "Nice place you've got here," Razor said, his tone mocking. Jake met his gaze but said nothing. "You're not much of a talker, huh?" Razor continued. He gestured to the farm. "This all yours?" Jake gave a single nod. "Must be tough, keeping a place like this running," Razor said, his voice laced with feigned sympathy. "Bet it'd be real hard if, I don't know, something bad happened." Jake's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough for Razor to notice. "Look," Razor said, spreading his arms. "We're not here to cause trouble. Just passing through. But you know how it is. Roads aren't cheap to maintain, and a little donation from the locals helps keep everything smooth." Jake's jaw tightened. He had seen men like Razor before, bullies who preyed on fear. "I don't have anything for you," Jake said evenly. Razor's grin faded, replaced by a cold glare. He stepped closer, towering over Jake. "I don't think you understand how this works. Old man, when I say donation, I'm not asking." Jake held his ground, his voice calm but firm. "You should leave." For a moment, the air between them was tense, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of the wind. Then Razor chuckled, stepping back. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Razor said. He turned to his gang. "Come on, boys, let's go." The bikers mounted their bikes and roared away, but not before one of them spat on the ground near Jake's feet. Jake watched them go, his expression unreadable. Inside, however, he felt a flicker of unease. Men like Razor didn't back down easily. Later that day, Jake's neighbor, Mr. Thompson, stopped by. He had heard about the gang's visit and was visibly shaken. "You need to call the sheriff," Mr. Thompson said urgently. "Those men are dangerous." Jake shook his head. "Calling the sheriff won't make them go away." "So what are you going to do?" Jake didn't answer. He simply looked out at his fields, the peaceful landscape suddenly feeling much smaller. That night, Jake sat on his porch, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Max lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of distant engines. Jake's mind drifted to his days in the service, memories of missions that had required him to outthink and outlast men just as dangerous as Razor. But this wasn't a battlefield. At least, it wasn't supposed to be. In the darkness, a decision began to form in Jake's mind. He had chosen this life for its simplicity and peace, but peace sometimes required action. And while he hoped the bikers would move on, he knew deep down that hope alone wasn't enough. Jake Carter wasn't looking for a fight, but if the fight came to him, he would be ready. The morning light had just begun to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink when Jake Carter stepped outside, a sturdy pair of gloves in one hand and a bucket of chicken feed in the other. Max, his loyal dog, padded along beside him, tail wagging lazily. It was a quiet morning, the kind Jake appreciated most. As he moved toward the chicken coop, the faint rumble of engines reached his ears. Jake stopped, his eyes narrowing as he turned his gaze toward the road. Dust billowed in the distance, and the unmistakable roar of motorcycles grew louder. The iron claws were coming. Jake stood still, his posture relaxed but his senses sharp. He had seen the gang in town just days ago, heard the stories of their intimidation tactics. Now they were here, and he had a feeling this visit wouldn't end with pleasantries. The bikers pulled into his driveway, their engines revving obnoxiously. Razor led the pack, his bike roaring like a beast as he rolled to a stop mere feet from where Jake stood. The other gang members fanned out behind him, their faces twisted with smug grins. "Well, well," Razor said, swinging a leg over his bike. He stood tall, his leather jacket creaking as he adjusted it. "If it isn't the man who thinks he's too good to help out a few weary travelers." Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he set the bucket of feed down beside him and crossed his arms. Max stood at his side, his ears perked and a low growl rumbling in his throat. "What do you want?" Jake asked calmly. Razor smirked, glancing around at the farm. Nice place you've got here. Real peaceful. Bet it'd be a shame if something disrupted that peace. Behind Razor, one of the bikers chuckled. Another spat on the ground, his expression full of disdain. Jake's voice was steady as he replied, "I've got nothing for you. Move along." The smirk vanished from Razor's face, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. He took a step closer, towering over Jake. "See, that's not how this works," Razor said, his voice low and menacing. "When I come asking for a little contribution, I'm not asking. You're going to give us what we want, or things might get unpleasant." Jake met Razor's gaze without flinching. His face was calm, but his blue eyes were like steel, unyielding and unreadable. "Unpleasant for who?" Jake asked quietly. The question seemed to catch Razor off guard for a moment, but he quickly recovered, letting out a bark of laughter. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts won't keep you safe." Behind Razor, the bikers began to fan out, eyeing the property with undisguised malice. One of them kicked at a fence post, while another leaned against the barn, his cigarette smoke curling into the air. Unbeknownst to Jake, Mr. Thompson had been watching from his front porch. The old man's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, dialing Jake's number. When there was no answer, he debated calling the sheriff, but hesitated. He knew Jake, knew the man's pride and his stubborn streak. But this was different. Grabbing his cane, Mr. Thompson shuffled down the road toward Jake's farm. By the time he arrived, the situation had escalated. "Jake," Mr. Thompson called out, his voice strained. "You need to call the sheriff." Razor turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the elderly man. "Who's this?" "Your backup." Jake raised a hand, motioning for Mr. Thompson to stay back. "Go home," Jake said firmly. "But go home, Mr. Thompson, I'll handle this." Reluctantly, Mr. Thompson retreated, casting a worried glance over his shoulder as he made his way back down the road. As Razor and his gang continued to mock and taunt, Jake's mind drifted, unbidden, to another time and place. It was a jungle, dense and suffocating, the air heavy with humidity and the scent of damp earth. Jake and his team moved in silence, their faces streaked with mud for camouflage. The mission was clear: infiltrate, extract the target, and get out. Jake remembered the tension, the weight of every decision resting on his shoulders. He had been the team leader, the one everyone relied on. And when things went south, as they often did, it was Jake who had to think fast, adapt, and ensure his team made it out alive. The memories were vivid. The crackle of radio static, the sound of distant gunfire, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he executed a plan with precision. Those days had shaped him, taught him to face danger head-on without hesitation. But they had also left scars, both physical and emotional. Jake snapped back to the present, his gaze locking onto Razor. Despite the gang's attempts to intimidate him, Jake remained calm, his body language giving nothing away. "You've had your fun," Jake said. "Now get off my property." Razor's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a snarl. "You've got a death wish, old man." "No," Jake replied, his voice steady. "I've got work to do." For a moment, Razor looked like he might lash out, but something in Jake's demeanor gave him pause. There was a quiet strength in the man that Razor couldn't quite place, something that made his instincts scream caution. Finally, Razor turned to his gang. "Let's go," he barked. The bikers hesitated, clearly wanting to press their luck, but they obeyed. One by one, they mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life. As they pulled away, Razor shot Jake a parting glare. "This isn't over," he called out. Jake watched them go, his face betraying no emotion. But as the sound of their engines faded into the distance, he let out a slow breath, his mind already turning over the implications of what had just happened. Later that evening, Mr. Thompson returned, his face lined with worry. "Jake, you've got to call the sheriff," he insisted. "Those men aren't going to back down." Jake was seated on his porch, that Max resting at his feet. He shook his head. "Calling the sheriff won't stop them. They'll just come back angrier." "So what are you going to do?" Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he gazed out at the horizon, where the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red. After a long moment, he said, "I'll figure something out." Mr. Thompson sighed, frustration mingling with concern. "You're a stubborn man, Jake Carter." Jake gave a faint smile. "You've been saying that for years." That night, Jake stood in his barn, the faint glow of a single bulb casting long shadows across the walls. He opened an old wooden chest, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside was a collection of items from his military days, a worn combat knife, a set of dog tags, and a small photograph of his team. He picked up the knife, turning it over in his hands. The weight of it was familiar, almost comforting. But as he looked at the blade, he felt a pang of conflict. He had left that life behind for a reason. Max padded over, sitting at Jake's feet. The dog looked up at him, as if sensing his turmoil. Jake knelt, scratching Max behind the ears. "Don't worry, boy," he said softly. "I'm not going back to that, not unless I have to." But even as he said the words, Jake knew the choice might not be his to make. Jake Carter had seen trouble before, but never like this. It started small, a broken fence post here, a few tools gone missing there. Jake fixed what he could, chalking it up to the gang's immaturity, and carried on. But the Iron Claws didn't stop, and the vandalism soon became more aggressive. One morning, Jake found his tractor missing. The vehicle, an old but reliable machine, was essential to his work. Tracks in the dirt led off his property, but Jake didn't follow them. He knew exactly who was responsible. Later that day, his barn bore the gang's mark. The snarling wolf's head, surrounded by claws, had been spray-painted across the wooden walls in garish red. Max barked furiously at the sight, pacing back and forth as if the paint carried the gang's scent. Jake stood silently, staring at the graffiti. His fists clenched, but his face remained calm. After a moment, he turned and walked toward the shed where he kept a stash of paint. He spent the next hour covering the symbol, his brushstrokes steady and deliberate. By the time the last of the gang's mark was concealed, his neighbor Mr. Thompson had arrived, hobbling down the road with his cane. "They're pushing you," Thompson said, his voice heavy with concern. "You can't just let them get away with this." Jake dipped the brush into the paint can again, not looking up. "Getting angry won't solve anything." "They stole your tractor, Jake. They're ruining your crops. What more do they have to do before you stand up to them?" Jake finally stopped, resting the brush on the edge of the can. His face was tired, but his eyes carried a quiet determination. "I'm not going to let them drag me down to their level," he said. "Violence doesn't solve violence." Thompson shook his head, frustration etched into his features. "They're counting on you thinking that, and one day, they're going to go too far." It wasn't long before Thompson's warning became reality. Emily, Thompson's teenage granddaughter, had been visiting her grandfather for the summer. She was a spirited girl with a quick wit and a fiery sense of justice. She had heard plenty about the Iron Claws and their antics, but seeing the gang in action was a different matter entirely. It was late afternoon when Emily spotted a few of the bikers near Jake's farm. They were leaning against their bikes, laughing and smoking as one of them scratched graffiti into the side of Jake's mailbox. Another was throwing rocks at the barn, each impact sending a sharp crack through the air. Emily didn't think twice. She marched across the field toward them, her sneakers kicking up dust. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice ringing out across the farm. The bikers turned, surprised to see the young girl. One of them, a lanky man with a sneer permanently etched on his face, stepped forward. "Well, what do we have here?" he drawled. "Leave him alone," Emily said, her hands on her hips. "What's wrong with you? Picking on an old man and ruining his farm? You think that makes you tough?" The gang erupted in laughter. "You've got a mouth on you, kid," the lanky man said, his grin widening. "Maybe you should think about keeping it shut." Emily didn't back down. "Why don't you think about leaving before the sheriff shows up?" The threat was hollow. She hadn't called anyone, but the bikers didn't know that. For a moment they exchanged uncertain glances. Then Razor appeared, striding out from behind the barn. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the laughter like a blade. The lanky man gestured toward Emily. "This little brat thinks she can tell us what to do." Razor's eyes settled on Emily, cold and calculating. He took a step closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. "You've got guts, kid," Razor said, "but guts won't save you if you get in over your head." Emily swallowed hard, her bravado wavering. "Why don't you run along before you get hurt?" Razor continued, his tone almost mocking. Before Emily could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "That's enough. Jake stood a few yards away, his posture calm but commanding. His voice carried a weight that silenced the bikers instantly. Razor turned, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well, if it isn't the man of the hour, you've got some nerve letting a kid fight your battles." "She's not fighting anything," Jake said evenly. "And neither are you. Take your men and go." Razor's smirk disappeared, replaced by a sneer. "You think you can tell me what to do?" Jake took a step closer, his eyes locked on Razor's. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet confidence that made Razor hesitate. "I'm telling you to leave," Jake said. "Now." For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension. Then Razor let out a bark of laughter, turning to his gang. "Come on, boys," he said. "Let's get out of here before Grandpa gives us a lecture." The bikers mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life. As they pulled away, Razor shot Jake a parting glare, his eyes full of unspoken threats. That evening, Jake sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Emily was inside with her grandfather, safe and sound, but the encounter weighed heavily on Jake's mind. He had spent years running from the man he used to be, choosing a life of peace over one of conflict. But the iron claws had pushed him to the edge, and the line between action and inaction was growing thinner by the day. Max rested at Jake's feet, his head on his paws. The dog let out a soft whine as if sensing his owner's turmoil. Jake reached down, scratching Max behind the ears. "What do we do, boy?" he murmured. "What do we do?" The stars began to appear one by one as the farm fell silent, but Jake's thoughts were anything but quiet. He knew the bikers wouldn't stop, knew they would push until something broke. The question was, how far would he let them go before he pushed back? Jake Carter had always been a man of quiet resolve, a man who believed peace was the best path forward. But even the most patient soul has a breaking point, and for Jake, that moment came at dawn. The day began like any other. Jake stepped outside with a cup of steaming coffee in hand, Max trotting faithfully beside him. He breathed in the crisp morning air and walked toward the barn. But as he rounded the corner, the sight before him stopped him cold. The tractor. It lay in the field, a crumpled heap of twisted metal. The sturdy machine, a wedding gift from his late wife, had been deliberately destroyed. The tires were slashed, the engine smashed, and deep gouges marred the once pristine paint. Jake set his coffee down slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he knelt beside the wreckage. His fingers brushed the familiar steel, memories flooding his mind. His wife's laughter as they christened the tractor with champagne. The hours they had spent working the fields together. The love they had poured into building this farm, one step at a time. He closed his eyes, drawing in a deep, steadying breath. When he opened them again, the warmth in his gaze was gone, replaced by something colder, harder, a spark of the man he used to be. Jake spent the morning in silence, walking the perimeter of his property with Max at his heels. He studied the damage the gang had inflicted over the past weeks, the broken fences, the graffiti, the crops trampled under heavy boots. This wasn't just vandalism anymore. It was a declaration of war. As Jake returned to the barn, his mind was already working, piecing together a plan. He opened the old wooden chest he had unearthed the night before, pulling out a tattered notebook. The pages were filled with sketches and notes, the remnants of his time as a Green Beret. Jake flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning old diagrams of traps, defensive strategies, and improvised tools. He had spent years honing these skills in the field, surviving in hostile environments where the odds were stacked against him. Now those skills would serve him once more. The first step was gathering supplies. Jake moved through the barn with purpose, his hands finding tools he hadn't used in years. Spools of wire, sturdy nails, planks of wood, and coils of rope were laid out on the workbench. Next, Jake began crafting his defenses. He worked methodically, setting traps along the perimeter of his property. He camouflaged pit traps with loose dirt and branches, carefully placing them near areas the bikers were likely to approach. Tripwires were strung between fence posts, connected to loud alarms made from repurposed car horns. Inside the barn, Jake prepared smoke bombs using fertilizer and sugar, packing the mixture into old mason jars. They weren't lethal, but they would disorient anyone foolish enough to enter his space uninvited. By mid-afternoon, sweat dripped from Jake's brow as he sharpened the old combat knife he had retrieved from the chest. It felt strange in his hand, the weight both familiar and foreign. Max watched from the corner of the barn, his head cocked as if trying to understand his owner's transformation. Jake paused, giving the dog a reassuring pat. "Don't worry, boy," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt anyone. Just send a message." As the sun began to set, Jake moved through the farm, testing his defenses and making adjustments where needed. He carried a flashlight in one hand and a clipboard in the other, marking off each completed task with the precision of a military officer. The final touch was a series of barricades around the barn and farmhouse. Using stacked hay bales, wooden pallets, and old tires, Jake created choke points that would funnel any intruders into specific areas. It was a classic tactic: control the battlefield and you control the fight. As he worked, flashes of his past surfaced: the jungles of Central America, the deserts of the Middle East. Missions where the odds seemed insurmountable, where every decision meant the difference between life and death. He hadn't wanted to return to that mindset, but the Iron Claws had left him no choice. They had pushed too far, and now they were going to learn what it meant to cross a man who knew how to fight. By the time the preparations were complete, night had fallen. Jake stood in the middle of his farm, surveying his work. The moonlight illuminated the fields, casting long shadows that danced in the breeze. He felt a strange sense of calm as he walked back to the porch. The farm was ready, and so was he. Inside the house, Jake sat at the kitchen table, an old photograph in his hands. It was a picture of him and his wife, taken years ago on the day they had bought the farm. She was smiling, her eyes full of life, her arm wrapped around his waist. "I'm sorry, Mary," Jake whispered. "I tried to keep my promise, but they've left me no choice." Max nudged his hand, breaking him from his thoughts. Jake smiled faintly, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Come on, boy," he said. "We've got work to do." As midnight approached, Jake moved through the farmhouse, checking every window and door. He carried a shotgun slung over his shoulder, not to kill, but to scare if necessary. Beside it, tucked into his belt, was the combat knife. He extinguished the lights, plunging the house into darkness. Then he took his position by the upstairs window, his eyes scanning the horizon. He didn't have to wait long. In the distance, the faint rumble of motorcycles reached his ears. The Iron Claws were coming. Jake's grip tightened on the shotgun as he whispered to himself, "Let's see how tough they really are." The bikers arrived in force, their headlights cutting through the night as they roared onto Jake's property. Razor was at the head of the pack, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He dismounted his bike, his men following suit, and strode toward the barn. But as soon as Razor stepped onto the property, he triggered the first tripwire. A loud alarm blared, startling the gang. "What the hell?" Razor shouted, spinning around as the sound echoed across the farm. Then came the smoke bombs. Clouds of thick, choking smoke filled the air, causing the bikers to cough and stumble. "What is this?" one of them yelled, panic creeping into his voice. Razor's frustration boiled over. "Spread out!" he barked. "Find him!" But every step the gang took only led them deeper into Jake's trap. One biker fell into a concealed pit, his shouts of surprise quickly muffled by the dirt. Another tripped over a wire, sending him tumbling into a pile of hay bales rigged to collapse. Razor's anger turned to confusion as his men were systematically taken out of the equation. He had underestimated Jake Carter, and now he was paying the price. From his vantage point, Jake watched the chaos unfold. He didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, only a grim determination to protect what was his. The Iron Claws were learning a hard lesson. This wasn't just a farm, it was a fortress, and Jake Carter was its defender. The silence of the night was deceptive, the kind of stillness that hinted at the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Jake Carter sat in the darkness of his kitchen, the room lit only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the window. Max lay at his feet, his ears perked and alert. The warning signs had been there all day. Motorcycles spotted circling the edges of town, Razor's men loitering too close to Jake's property, their voices carrying on the wind as they discussed their plans. Jake had no doubt they were coming. He checked the shotgun resting on the table, the weight of it familiar yet foreign. It wasn't his weapon of choice. Jake never wanted it to come to this. But the Iron Claws weren't just vandals anymore. They had crossed a line, and tonight they would pay for it. It began with the rumble of engines, distant but unmistakable. Jake stood and moved to the window, his sharp eyes catching the faint glow of headlights on the horizon. The gang was approaching, their intentions as clear as the gas cans some of them carried. "They're here, Max," Jake said softly. The dog growled low in his throat, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Jake slipped out the back door, his boots silent on the dirt. The farm stretched out before him, every corner prepared and fortified. He had spent days setting the stage, and now it was time to act. The bikers arrived in a roar of noise and light, their engines shattering the peace of the night. Razor was at the front, his silhouette imposing against the glow of the headlamps. He dismounted his bike, gesturing for his men to follow. "Burn it all," he said coldly. The gang moved with purpose, spreading out across the property. One of them approached the barn, a can of gasoline in hand. He didn't notice the tripwire until it was too late. The explosion wasn't lethal, but the smoke bomb detonated with enough force to send the man sprawling, coughing, and disoriented. The gang froze, their confidence wavering. "What the hell was that?" one of them shouted. Razor snarled, his eyes scanning the shadows. "He's playing games. Stay sharp." But Jake wasn't playing games. He was hunting. From his position near the barn, Jake watched as the gang stumbled into his traps. The alarms blared, disorienting them further. One by one, the bikers fell victim to his carefully laid plans. A man attempting to sneak around the back of the farmhouse triggered a snare, his leg yanked out from under him as he dangled helplessly from a tree. Another tripped over a camouflage tripwire, crashing into a stack of barrels that came tumbling down with a deafening clatter. Jake moved through the chaos like a shadow, striking swiftly and silently. He didn't fight to injure. His goal was to disarm, disorient, and intimidate. Razor's frustration turned to fury as he watched his men fall one by one. He grabbed the nearest biker, shaking him roughly. "Where is he?" Razor demanded. "I don't know, man," the biker stammered. "He's everywhere." Razor shoved him aside, his gaze locking onto the barn. He pulled a lighter from his pocket, the flame flickering in the dark. "If he wants a fight, he'll get one," Razor growled. He approached the barn, the lighter held high, but before he could take another step, a low growl stopped him in his tracks. Max stepped out of the shadows, his teeth bared and his hackles raised. The dog didn't lunge, but his presence was enough to make Razor hesitate. "Stupid mutt," Razor muttered, reaching for his knife. Before Razor could act, a voice cut through the night. "Don't." Jake emerged from the darkness, his shotgun leveled at Razor. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard, unyielding. "Drop it," Jake said. Razor hesitated, his grip tightening on the knife. "I won't ask again," Jake warned. Something in Jake's tone, an edge honed by years of experience, made Razor reconsider. He let the knife fall to the ground, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Looks like the old man's still got some fight in him," Razor sneered. Jake didn't lower the shotgun. "This ends now. Call off your men." Razor's sneer faltered as he looked around. His gang was in disarray, half of them incapacitated or retreating. The tables had turned, and Razor knew it. As Razor reluctantly called for his men to fall back, Jake's mind flashed to another time, another battlefield. He saw the faces of his old unit, their voices echoing in his memory as they navigated hostile territory. The skills he had honed in those distant lands had saved lives, but they had also taken a toll. He had sworn to leave that life behind, to build something better for himself and his wife. Now, as he stood on his farm, facing down a gang of thugs, Jake Carter understood something he hadn't wanted to admit. The skills he had sworn never to use again weren't just a curse. They were a gift, a part of who he was. And tonight, they had allowed him to protect the life he had worked so hard to build. Razor glared at him, the fire in his eyes dimming as he took in the state of his men. The mighty iron claws, reduced to a disorganized rabble by a single man and his dog. Razor's arrogance faltered as he saw the unwavering determination in Jake's gaze. "This ain't over, old man," Razor spat, his bravado barely masking his fear. Jake took a step forward, the shotgun still steady in his hands. His voice was low, almost a growl. "It is over. You come back here, and you'll wish you hadn't." The weight of Jake's words hung heavy in the air. Razor, for all his bluster, knew when he was beaten. He turned to his men, barking orders for them to retreat. One by one, the bikers stumbled to their motorcycles. battered and humiliated. Engines roared to life, and the gang rode off into the night, their departure as loud and chaotic as their arrival. Jake stood motionless until the sound of the bikes faded into silence. He lowered the shotgun, exhaling slowly. Max trotted over to him, tail wagging as if to say, "We did it." Jake knelt, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Good boy, Max. You did good." The aftermath was quiet, almost surreal. Jake walked the property, inspecting the damage. Most of the traps had been triggered, but the barn was intact, the fields untouched by fire. He picked up Razor's discarded knife, turning it over in his hands before tossing it into a nearby pile of scrap metal. As he worked, his mind drifted to the past again. He saw himself in the heat of combat, leading his team through impossible missions. He remembered the decisions that had weighed on him, the lives he had saved, and the ones he hadn't. Those memories had haunted him for years, but tonight they felt different. They weren't a burden anymore. They were a reminder of what he was capable of. The first rays of dawn were breaking when Jake returned to the farmhouse. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the simple routine grounding him after the chaos of the night. Max curled up on the floor, already asleep. As Jake sat at the kitchen table, a knock at the door startled him. He stood, shotgun at the ready, before relaxing at the sight of Mr. Thompson standing on the porch. The old man's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his hat. Behind him stood Emily, her eyes wide with concern. "Jake," Mr. Thompson began, his voice shaky. "We heard the commotion last night. Are you all right?" Jake nodded. "I'm fine. They won't be bothering us anymore." Emily stepped forward, her gaze locking onto Jake's. "You scared them off, didn't you? You protected all of us." Jake hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't acted for glory or recognition. He had done what needed to be done. "Just looking out for the farm," he said finally. Emily smiled, a mixture of gratitude and admiration shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." As the Thompsons left, Jake stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over the fields. The farm was quiet again, the way it was meant to be. He knew the Iron Claws might come back someday, but he also knew he would be ready. Not just for them, but for whatever challenges life threw his way. Jake Carter wasn't just a farmer. He was a protector, a survivor, a man who had learned to carry the weight of his past without letting it define him. And as he stood there, the warmth of the morning sun on his face, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The dawn had barely stretched its fingers across the horizon when Razor made his return, trailing humiliation and anger like a storm cloud. For hours after the retreat, he had paced at the edge of town, his mind a chaotic mess of fury and disbelief. His men were silent, bruised and shaken, unwilling to meet his eyes. Razor's pride burned hotter than his anger. He couldn't let this stand. A lone farmer bringing the mighty Iron Claws to their knees? No, Razor had to reclaim his dominance, and there was only one way to do that. He had to make Jake Carter pay. The sound of Razor's motorcycle shattered the morning's stillness. This time, he rode alone, his gang left behind to nurse their wounds and their shame. He revved the engine as he approached Jake's farm, the roar echoing like a battle cry. Jake was already waiting. Standing in front of the barn, his arms crossed over his chest, Jake watched Razor's approach with the calm detachment of a man who had seen far worse. Max sat by his side, his posture alert but unafraid. Razor skidded to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dust as he dismounted. His leather jacket was streaked with grime, his face twisted in rage. "You think you can humiliate me?" Razor snarled, stalking toward Jake. "You think you're better than me, old man?" Jake's gaze didn't waver. "Go home, Razor. You've lost." The word struck Razor like a slap, and he lunged forward, grabbing Jake by the collar. For a moment it seemed like he might have the upper hand, until Jake moved. In a blur of motion, Jake twisted out of Razor's grip, using the man's own momentum to send him stumbling. Razor barely caught himself before hitting the ground, spinning around with wild eyes. "You want to fight?" Jake said, his voice low and steady. "Then come on. Let's finish this." Razor charged, his fists swinging wildly, but Jake wasn't there to meet them. The retired Green Beret sidestepped the blows with practiced ease, his movements calculated and precise. Razor swung again, his knuckles grazing the air as Jake ducked. The younger man's frustration boiled over, and he reached for the knife at his belt, a different one than the blade he had abandoned earlier. Jake's eyes narrowed. "Put it down, Razor. You don't want this fight." But Razor was beyond reason. He lunged again, the knife flashing in the morning light. This time, Jake didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped into the attack, grabbing Razor's wrist and twisting it with practiced precision. The knife clattered to the ground as Razor cried out in pain. Jake pushed him back, his voice sharp. "That's enough!" Razor staggered, clutching his wrist. The fight was over, and he knew it. But Jake wasn't finished. "Get in the barn," Jake ordered, pointing toward the large wooden doors behind him. Razor hesitated, his bravado crumbling under Jake's unyielding gaze. Reluctantly, he moved toward the barn, stumbling inside as Jake followed close behind. The barn was dimly lit, the morning light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. Razor looked around, his breathing ragged, his nerves fraying with each passing second. Jake stood between him and the exit, his posture relaxed but his presence imposing. Max had followed them in, the dog's sharp eyes locked on Razor. "You think you're tough," Jake said, his voice steady. "You think you can take what you want, hurt whoever you want, and walk away without consequences. But let me tell you something, Razor. Men like you are a dime a dozen. And men like me? We stop men like you." Razor sneered, though his bravado was laced with fear. "You're just an old man playing soldier." Jake took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I was a soldier, and the things I've seen, the things I've done, you couldn't begin to understand. But what I learned, it's not about brute force. It's about knowing when to act and when to stop." Razor said nothing, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Jake's words. Jake pointed to a battered wooden chair in the center of the barn. "Sit." Razor hesitated, but the look in Jake's eyes left no room for argument. He sank into the chair, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're going to make this right," Jake said. "You and your gang are going to confess to everything you've done, to me, to this town, and you're going to apologize." Razor scoffed. "Like hell I will." Jake leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have a choice. I've got a dozen witnesses to what you and your men did last night, and I've got the evidence to back it up. You don't come clean, the sheriff will make sure you're locked up for a long time." The threat wasn't an idle one. Razor could see it in Jake's eyes, the unshakable resolve of a man who had faced far greater challenges than a petty gang leader. Hours later, the Iron Claws gathered in the center of town, Razor standing at the front. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as Razor mumbled an apology, his voice barely audible. Jake stood nearby, his presence a silent reminder of the consequences of defiance. When the gang finally left, their tails tucked between their legs, a collective sigh of relief swept through the town. Jake nodded to Mr. Thompson, who stood near the edge of the crowd with Emily, and began the walk back to his farm. For Jake, the fight was over, for now. He knew there would always be another challenge, another threat to face. But as he reached the top of the hill overlooking his fields, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The farm was safe, the town was safe. And Jake Carter, the quiet farmer with a soldier's soul, had proven once again that some battles are worth fighting. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields. Jake stood on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws. The quiet was a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Jake glanced at the barn, where the remnants of Razor's reign were still visible, but the scars on the barn were just marks on a structure. The real damage had been done to the town's sense of peace. He thought about the Iron Claws, a gang of bullies who had thought they could intimidate a small town. They had learned a hard lesson, a lesson that Jake hoped would serve as a warning to anyone who dared to threaten the tranquility of Red Hollow. But Jake also knew that the world was full of darkness, and that darkness could manifest in many forms. He would always be vigilant, always ready to protect his home and his community. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Jake turned his attention to the future. He had plans for the farm, plans that involved Emily, who had shown a surprising knack for gardening. He imagined a future where the farm would not just be a source of sustenance, but also a place of learning and growth. He smiled, thinking of the boy he had once been, a young man with dreams and ambitions. He had come a long way, facing challenges and overcoming obstacles, but the boy within him still lived, still dreamed of a better world. Jake took a sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through his body. He had faced his demons, fought his battles, and emerged victorious. Now it was time to move forward, to embrace the future with hope and optimism. After all, every sunrise brings a new day, a new opportunity. And for Jake Carter, the dawn of a new era had just begun. Moral of the story: even in the face of adversity, it is important to remain true to oneself and to stand up for what is right. Sometimes the quietest among us possess the greatest strength, and the most unexpected heroes can rise to meet the challenge. That's the story, friends. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a pleasure sharing it with you all. Don't forget to comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It's always fun to see the global reach of these stories. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button for more amazing stories, tips, and tricks. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.